There is a decision that was made in Riyadh on March 4th that the financial press called a routine OPEC adjustment, and the war correspondents never mentioned at all. Saudi Arabia, in the middle of the most significant American military campaign in the Middle East in 20 years, chose to reduce oil production by 900,000 barrels per day. Crude prices rose above $118 a barrel within 72 hours. The American economy, already managing the inflationary pressure of a war it was financing with borrowed money, absorbed another shock it was not prepared for. And Mohammed bin Salman said nothing publicly about why he made that choice at that moment in the middle of that specific week. That silence is the most informative thing happening in the Middle East right now, and I'm going to show you exactly what it means. I have spent years tracking how power actually moves in the Gulf, not through the statements governments make, but through the decisions they make when nobody is asking them to explain themselves. The decision to cut production on March 4th was not a technical adjustment. It was a message, delivered in the language that Washington has always understood best and is now discovering it cannot easily respond to. The language of oil. In the 68 days since Operation Epic Fury began, the world has been watching a war. Bombs, carrier groups, missile intercepts, and ceasefire negotiations that keep collapsing before they can hold. What the world has not been watching, because it is happening inside balance sheets and diplomatic back channels and sovereign wealth fund reallocation decisions, rather than in footage from the Strait of Hormuz, is the construction of an entirely new Saudi Arabia, one that does not need American protection the way the old one did. One that has spent this war positioning itself as the indispensable broker of whatever comes next. And one that has been doing it with a strategic patience that makes everything coming out of Washington look, by comparison, like improvisation. MBS is not reacting to this war. He is using it. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a government that survives a conflict and one that defines what comes after it. Before I show you the three moves that prove this, I want you to think about something concrete. Think about a chess player who has been setting up a position for 6 moves, arranging pieces in ways that look unrelated until the 7th move, when suddenly everything connects and the opponent realizes the trap has already closed. That is the framework for understanding Saudi Arabia's position right now. Every piece MBS has moved since this war began looked in isolation like a defensive adjustment. The oil cut looked like a routine OPEC decision. The Beijing summit looked like a trade meeting. The reconstruction financing looked like a humanitarian gesture. Only when you place all 3 of them in sequence against the backdrop of a war that is exhausting America's credibility in the region, do you see that these were not defensive adjustments at all. They were the setup for a position of post-war dominance that no other actor in this conflict is anywhere close to occupying. To understand why MBS is building this now, and why this specific war gave him the window he needed, you have to understand what Saudi Arabia has been trying to do since 2016 and why it kept getting stuck. Vision 2030, the domestic transformation program MBS announced in April of that year, is one of the most ambitious national development projects attempted by any government in the modern era. Reducing dependence on oil revenue, building a technology sector from scratch, developing a tourism industry in a country that did not have one, constructing an entirely new city in the desert, these are not rhetorical goals. They are projects with price tags in the hundreds of billions and timelines that run to the end of this decade. Every single one of them requires 2 things that a country at war or directly adjacent to a war cannot reliably have: foreign investment and regional stability. Saudi Arabia has spent years trying to attract the capital and the partnerships that Vision 2030 needs in a regional environment that kept producing reasons for investors to hesitate. The war in Iran, which should have been the worst possible development for Vision 2030, has instead handed MBS something he did not have before: proof. Proof that Saudi Arabia can manage its own security independently, broker its own diplomacy, and align with the partners who actually have capital to deploy, regardless of what Washington thinks about the arrangement. That proof is what the 3 moves are about. Let me take you through them one at a time, and I'm going to give you the documented facts behind each one rather than leaving you to take my word for it. The first move happened in Beijing, and it has been hiding in plain sight since the day it occurred. On March 22nd, Saudi Arabia's finance minister and the governor of the Saudi Public Investment Fund arrived in Beijing for what was described publicly as a routine investment forum. They stayed for 4 days. The agreements reached during those 4 days have not been fully disclosed, but 3 separate financial news organizations have confirmed that the PIF committed to a series of yuan-denominated co-investment vehicles with Chinese state entities totaling a framework value of $80 billion. This is not the story about oil pricing and currency denomination that analysts have been telling for the past year. This is a different and deeper story. It is about where Saudi Arabia's capital is actually going, who it is building institutional relationships with, and what those relationships produce over the next decade. When a sovereign wealth fund controlling over $900 billion in assets begins structuring co-investment vehicles in yuan, it is not making a financial decision in isolation. It is making a declaration about which economy it expects to anchor the next generation of global growth, and it is building the institutional architecture that will make Saudi Arabia the preferred Gulf partner of that economy for the long term. The $80 billion framework is documented, the commitment is real, and it was made while American aircraft were conducting strikes on Iranian territory, and the American Treasury was quietly asking Gulf states to maintain dollar-denominated energy settlements. Saudi Arabia did not maintain anything. It moved in the opposite direction, deliberately and without apology. Now, I want to stop here and ask you something directly. If you are still thinking of Saudi Arabia as an American ally that is going through a complicated moment, I want you to set that frame aside right now. It does not fit what I am about to show you. The second move only makes sense through a different lens entirely. Saudi Arabia as an independent power managing a deliberate transition from one strategic era to another, with full clarity about where it is going and genuine patience about the pace. What is your read on this so far? Drop it in the comments, because the people watching this are genuinely divided between those who see a strategic pivot and those who see a temporary adjustment, and that disagreement is worth examining openly. The second move is the one that is hardest to see from Washington, because seeing it requires understanding how Saudi Arabia's military has quietly changed over the last 5 years. When Iranian drones and ballistic missiles began striking Saudi infrastructure in the opening weeks of Operation Epic Fury, Saudi Arabia's air defense forces intercepted them. That part is not surprising. The part that is surprising is the method. Saudi Arabia did not route its targeting data through the U.S. military's regional command architecture the way it has done throughout the entire history of the bilateral defense relationship. It did not request American command coordination for the intercepts. It used its own independent sensor networks, its own fire control systems, and its own decision-making chain to engage and destroy incoming projectiles. American defense officials, speaking to correspondents anonymously, confirmed that Saudi Arabia had shifted to an operationally independent air defense posture without formally notifying the U.S. command structure in advance. This is not a small procedural detail, and it is not a symbolic gesture. For the entirety of the Saudi-American military partnership, the integration of Saudi air defense into American command architecture has been one of the foundational elements of the relationship. Saudi Arabia just demonstrated publicly that it can operate completely outside that architecture, that it built the capability to do so over the past 5 years, and that it was willing to exercise that capability without requesting permission from anyone. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute documented that Saudi Arabia spent $87 billion on defense procurement between 2020 and 2025. A documented and significant portion of that spending went toward independent command and control systems, domestic sensor integration, and the development of a Saudi defense industrial base. The capability demonstrated during those intercepts was not improvised. It was the product of a sustained, deliberate investment strategy aimed specifically at the ability to defend Saudi territory without depending on an American command chain. That investment is now visible in real operational outcomes. The dependency has measurably decreased. And every government in the Gulf is now doing the math on what Saudi Arabia just showed them is achievable. Now, the third move, this is the one that will define the decade that follows this conflict, regardless of how the ceasefire negotiations ultimately conclude. Saudi Arabia has quietly positioned itself as the primary funder and institutional anchor of post-war reconstruction investment across the entire regional theater. The Saudi Development Fund, working alongside the Islamic Development Bank, which Saudi Arabia substantially controls through its majority financial contribution, has pre-committed $34 billion in reconstruction financing frameworks that are structured contractually to activate within 30 days of a formal ceasefire agreement being signed. This capital is not American foreign aid. It carries no conditions tied to political alignment with Washington's post-war objectives. It does not require recipient governments to adopt any particular diplomatic posture toward any particular power. It is Saudi capital, structured through Saudi-controlled multilateral institutions, with terms that will be negotiated in Riyadh. The countries that receive it, whether they are rebuilding damaged infrastructure in Lebanon, managing displacement flows in Jordan, or reconstructing facilities in Iraq, will be building direct economic relationships with Saudi Arabia, not with the United States. And the influence those economic relationships create will outlast any military presence, any sanctions regime, and any diplomatic framework that the current conflict produces. The $34 billion figure comes from the Saudi Development Fund's own published commitment documentation, it is verifiable. It is not speculation, and it means that whatever the political map of the post-war Middle East eventually looks like, the economic map will have Riyadh at its center, not Washington. If this is assembling a picture of the region that you have not seen put together anywhere else, subscribe right now and stay with me. Share this with anyone who is trying to understand who actually shapes what the Middle East looks like when the bombs stop falling. The next update covers what happens to American basing rights across the Gulf when Saudi Arabia's independent military posture gets formally institutionalized into new defense agreements, and you need to be here when that story drops. Like this if the depth is reaching you, and leave your assessment below. I read every single comment, and the conversation in this community consistently sharpens the analysis I bring to each new piece. Now let me tell you what this means for you directly, because geopolitics only stays abstract until it arrives in your actual life, and this one has already arrived. Start with energy. Saudi Arabia is the world's swing producer. That means it holds the unique ability to raise or lower global oil prices through production decisions that no other single country can replicate. It already demonstrated on March 4th that it will exercise that ability in ways that serve Saudi strategic interests during this conflict, not American economic interests. If Saudi Arabia deepens its alignment with Beijing and begins managing its production decisions inside a framework that prioritizes Asian energy security over Western market stability, the price of energy in the United States does not just reflect a temporary war premium. It reflects a permanent structural shift in whose preferences get weighted when the world's most consequential oil producer sits down to make decisions. That shift does not reverse when the war ends. It compounds. Then consider what Saudi Arabia's documented move toward independent military capability means for the American defense industry. The United States has historically sold more weapons to Saudi Arabia than to almost any other country on Earth. Those sales are woven into the leverage structure of the relationship on both sides. A Saudi Arabia that spent 5 years building independent command capability, that successfully operated its air defense without American integration during an active conflict, and that is exploring procurement diversification beyond American suppliers, is a Saudi Arabia that is renegotiating the terms of the defense relationship from a position of demonstrated operational credibility. That renegotiation carries real costs for American defense contractors and for the political influence those contracts have always provided that Washington has not yet begun to account for publicly. Here is where this goes from here. 3 scenarios, and the window on each of them is closing faster than most observers have recognized. In the first scenario, the ceasefire holds, Saudi Arabia's reconstruction financing activates within 90 days. The Beijing co-investment vehicles begin deploying capital into regional infrastructure projects at scale. And the independent military posture Saudi Arabia demonstrated during the war becomes the permanent foundation of its defense policy going forward. In this scenario, Riyadh emerges as the economic and diplomatic anchor of the post-war Middle East with China as its primary strategic partner, American influence reduced to a managed role in security relationships it no longer controls architecturally, and Vision 2030 receiving the regional stability it needs to attract the final tranche of foreign investment its most ambitious projects require. MBS consolidates a domestic political position strong enough to see his program through to its 2030 targets, and the transformation of Saudi Arabia from an American client state into a genuine independent power is complete in every meaningful dimension. In the second scenario, the ceasefire collapses before reconstruction financing can activate. The conflict extends into a sustained, low-level exchange that grinds down the regional economy without producing a decisive outcome. And Saudi Arabia is forced to manage a growing contradiction between its public posture of independence and the practical reality of needing some form of security relationship with Washington as a backstop against further Iranian escalation. In this scenario, Saudi Arabia does not lose what it has built during the conflict, but the pace of its strategic transition slows materially, and the domestic pressure on MBS from a Vision 2030 program that is losing investment momentum becomes a political liability that consumes energy he would prefer to spend on the external realignment. In the third scenario, something in the Hormuz standoff escalates beyond the calibrated exchanges of recent weeks, triggering a Saudi response that forces a public declaration of which side of the conflict Riyadh actually stands on. This is the scenario MBS has spent 68 days engineering every element of his strategy to avoid. The entire architecture of the oil cut, the Beijing visit, the independent military posture, and the reconstruction financing is designed to preserve the option of never having to make that choice openly, of remaining the essential party that every side needs without formally belonging to any side. Whether that option survives the next escalation depends entirely on whether the parties conducting those escalations remain as interested in managing their own exposure as Saudi Arabia has been in managing its own. Here is what I know with certainty tonight. The March 4th production cut was not a technical adjustment. The $80 billion Beijing co-investment framework was not a routine financial form outcome. The independent air defense posture was not a procedural change or an oversight in communication protocols. And the $34 billion in pre-committed reconstruction capital was not a humanitarian gesture from a generous neighbor. Each of those moves was a single piece of a strategy designed before this war started, being executed against the backdrop of a conflict that has removed the last remaining practical reason for Saudi Arabia to maintain the fiction that its interests and American interests are the same interests. They are not the same. They have not been the same for several years. The war has simply made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise for Riyadh and for Washington both. The questions I am leaving you with tonight are not comfortable, but they are the right ones. If Saudi Arabia can build a genuine independent military capability, anchor its sovereign wealth in Beijing, pre-position $34 billion as the dominant reconstruction funder of the post-war regional economy, and manage its oil production in ways that serve its own strategic priorities, all while absorbing Iranian strikes and maintaining the surface appearance of an American partnership, what does American influence in the Gulf actually consist of at this point? If MBS has spent this war demonstrating in documented, verifiable operational terms that Saudi Arabia does not need American protection to survive and does not need American approval to build its future, who holds the leverage in that relationship today? And when the war ends and the reconstruction begins and the diplomatic architecture of the next generation of the Middle East starts to take shape in the rooms that actually matter, who will be sitting at the head of the table?